Hey guys, now that you know what an argument is, it's important to understand that not all arguments are equal. There are different types of arguments, and we're going to go over those different types today. Now, to exemplify the different types, I'm going to give an example of each. We'll talk about what makes the first argument different from the second argument, and that's going to naturally flow into this distinction between the two argument types that we're going to talk about today. So, let's refer back to the really basic argument that I said you're going to see in all your philosophy classes in the last video, right? And this is the idea that you have premise one, all humans are mortal, and premise two, me, Professor Steely, is human. And so you conclude from that I am immortal. Right? No curveballs there. That's fairly straightforward. But let's look at a different argument. Let's say that this argument looks something like this. The first premise was my dog likes to sleep on my couch. Right, sloppily. Okay, and then let's say the second premise is my neighbor has a couch. Think what might follow from that, right? If my dog likes to sleep on our couch, and if my neighbor has a couch, you might say, oh, well, therefore, that my dog will like to sleep on our neighbor's couch, right? Now, what makes this argument different from the first argument? Well, let's look at the first one. All humans are mortal. Professor Seeley is human. Therefore, Professor Seeley is mortal. So, I think it's safe to assume that you would say, yep, this conclusion follows from the premises, right? But you might also say that over here. So what makes the two different? Here's a question. If both of these premises were true, could this conclusion be false? In other words, if you took these premises as true, would it be possible for this conclusion not to follow? And the answer is no. It wouldn't be possible for this conclusion to not follow if these premises were true, right? It would have to be true. Let's look over here. Even if you assume that these premises are true, is it absolutely going to be the case that my dog is going to like to sleep on my neighbor's couch? No, right? Like, can you imagine that my dog likes to sleep on my couch, my neighbor has a couch, but that, for some reason the dog doesn't like to sleep on the neighbor's couch? Yeah, you could definitely imagine that. Aha. That's the difference between these two things. This first argument is what you would call a deduction or a deductive argument. This second over here, this is what you would call an induction or an inductive argument. So let's look at these two concepts a bit more closely. So a deductive argument is one where we say the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. Right, and one thing to be aware of is that logicians and philosophers, when they use terms really meaningfully and literally, like for a specific reason. So when we say the word necessarily, we mean necessarily, right? We don't mean probably. We don't mean reasonably. We don't mean could. We mean like absolutely has to, right? There's no way it couldn't follow, if you want to state it in the negative, right? To say that a conclusion necessarily follows is to say that it's impossible for that conclusion not to follow. Or like we said, if the premises are true, if, right, this is hypothetical, and that's going to be important, especially in the next lesson, it couldn't happen that the conclusion was false. Right? So another way there's a couple different ways of saying this. Something that also might be helpful is to say that the conclusion, it's already contained within the premises. Right? And that's like exactly why the conclusion necessarily follows, because the conclusion's already there. Like it's already in the premises. So you can't then deny something that's already in the premises. And one way to understand this, so obviously it's kind of like figurative and spatial sounding, but it really means that. So let's look at it visually. Think about the previous argument, right? The thing about humans and mortality and me. Make it like a kind of Venn diagram. Not exactly like a Venn diagram, but think of concepts in terms of containers. That's a container, right? Like a concept has a specific meaning within bounds, right? So it's a container. And think of claims like that as well. So you have a circle to represent humans. Capital letters. And what the argument was saying is that all humans are mortal, meaning all of the things that happen within this domain of human must also take place within the domain of mortality, right? If all humans are mortal, that means that there are no humans that are not mortal, right? Which is to say that the circle of human happens within the circle of mortality, right? And then that second premise tells you that I am a human, right? Which is to say that I am not human, right? So the circle that is me will therefore go within the human circle. And so, wait a second. If the circle of me, so to speak, is in the human circle, then the me circle is already in the mortal circle. So quite literally, the conclusion is already contained within the premises. That's a visual way of understanding what's happening, right? So it necessarily follows. And again, I'm always going to repeat, that word means literally necessary, right? Okay, so what might be another example of a deductive argument? I'll give you one. Premise 1. I have known you guys for 3 weeks. Okay? Then you can conclude necessarily, so therefore, I have known you all for at least 1 week. Has to follow, right? Because 3 is greater than 1, right? There is no such thing as knowing someone for 3 weeks without knowing them for at least 1 week. So when you say that you know someone for 3 weeks, it's already in there that you've known them for at least 1 week, right? It would be impossible for you to not to know someone for at least 1 week if you knew them for 3 weeks, right? That follows the same structure here, right? Same kind of logic. All right, now how is this different from inductive arguments? Well, actually, really quick, back up. Let me just say one thing. You might be tempted to think that, oh, a deduction sounds like you're going from big to something small, right? Like you're deducting from a quantity or something. But that's not what it means, because it's not always a matter of going of big to small. It could be that, but it doesn't have to be. So for example, the move from I've known you for 3 weeks, therefore I've known you for at least 1 week is not like deducing something like that, right? You're not going from an all to a particular, whereas you are in this example, right? Or if I said like, this object has 3 sides, and you say, oh, well, therefore this object has less sides than something with 5 sides. Right, again, so that's not a matter of like an all statement to a particular statement. It's just a matter of kind of drawing out definitively in the conclusion what is already there necessarily within the premises. All right, so we got deductions down, at least in principle. So the question now is, what is an induction, right? What is inductive reasoning? Well, think about this. Think about the dog example in the beginning. It wasn't the same as the human and mortality argument, right? Because it didn't have to follow, right, that the dog was going to like my neighbor's couch. So the way we describe this in terms of the general form here is you would say inductive arguments are ones in which the conclusion possibly follows from the premises. And so to leave no room for ambiguity or pushback, I'm going to say, when we say the conclusion possibly, we mean the conclusion like only possibly follows, right? Possibly, but not necessarily. Why do I add that? Well, because if something necessarily follows, it must be possible for it to follow. So that also possibly follows, but not only is it possibly following, it's necessarily following, whereas with inductive arguments, it's possibly following, but not necessarily. And the key here is that in no inductive argument, no matter how good it is, will the conclusion absolutely follow. So if you think of this in terms of like probability, even if there was a 99% chance that the conclusion would follow, it's still inductive. Probability is possibility. It's likelihood, right? Probability is not necessity. Probably following is not the same thing as necessarily following, right? Because even if something probably follows, that means it most likely follows, but it's possible that it could not, right? You can imagine, even if the premises are true, that the conclusion wouldn't follow. And why is that? Well, because in inductive arguments, the conclusion is not already contained within the premises. That's an important point. Because the conclusion isn't already contained within the premises, it's not absolutely so that the conclusion will follow. Right? You can imagine other conclusions happening and that conclusion being false, even if the premises are true. Whereas the opposite is the case when we're talking about deductive arguments. So what would be a good example of an inductive argument? Well, you could say something like, so we had the dog example, right? But let's do another one. Let's say you say, premise one, 90% of students at University X, like some school, are undergraduates. Right? Which means only 10% of the students are grad students. And in the second premise, you say, Bob, right? Just insert random name, is a student at University X. So 90% of students at the university are undergraduates. Bob is a student at this particular university. And so you would conclude, oh, so Bob is an undergrad, right? Like if someone said, oh, is that the case? You would probably say, well, yeah, probably. If 90% of them are this thing, and Bob is one of them, then yeah, there's a 90% chance that he's that thing. Only a 10% chance that he isn't. So you would place all your bets on him being that, right? Like you wouldn't bet against the odds on this. However, isn't it true that even if 90% of students are undergraduates at the university, and even if Bob is a student at the university, isn't it possible that he just could be in the minority and could be a graduate student? Yeah, because 90% means not all. And so since it's not all, there are undoubtedly other students at the university that aren't in the set, right? That aren't in the set of undergrad. So yeah, Bob probably is an undergrad, but he's not necessarily. You can imagine that he's not. That's not already contained within the premises. That's why that's an inductive argument. That is exactly why that's an inductive argument. It's not the same thing as the human immortality example or the knowing you for 3 weeks, therefore I've known you for 1 week's example. It's not the same thing, right? It's fundamentally different. And one connection that I think is maybe helpful to make is, well, let me say one thing first. Even though the conclusion in inductive arguments doesn't necessarily follow, doesn't mean that inductive arguments are bad, right? Like inductive doesn't equal bad. Deductive doesn't equal good, right? There could be good inductive arguments, and there could be quote unquote bad deductive arguments, and we'll talk about what these things mean in the next lesson when we talk about how to evaluate arguments of different kinds. But yeah, so don't think about it like, oh, these are bad, because most arguments you'll encounter about empirical things, so that's an interesting connection, are going to be inductive arguments. Like very rarely out in the world is there going to be some issue involving particular events and the past and the future and likelihood and probability. Like those aren't going to be deductive. So these aren't bad. But what I was saying before is that I think it's helpful when trying to distinguish between deduction and induction to recall the distinction between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge, because that's related. Think about how it might be related, right? Because a priori knowledge was knowledge that you'd be able to have by reason and reason alone prior to sense experience, right? Whereas a posteriori knowledge is knowledge that you can't gain from reason alone by thinking about definitions, right, and relations between principles, but rather you need to look beyond that into the world, so to speak. Use your senses to verify those things, right? And if you think about it, That's how you can distinguish between the two types of arguments, because since the conclusion necessarily follows, because the conclusion is already contained within the premises in a deductive argument, you can know a priori, right, that the conclusion follows from the premises, because it's all about principally what's possible and what's impossible. So because the conclusion is already contained within the premises in a deductive argument, because the conclusion necessarily follows as a result of that, you can therefore say that, given the truth of the premises, that you would have a priori knowledge that the conclusion would also be true in a deductive argument, right? Because again, you're thinking about possibility, impossibility, necessity, and contingency or something like that, right? You're just thinking about the hypothetical relationship between the premises and the conclusion. And so if you say, I've known you for 3 weeks, you know a priori, without going into the world and looking, that I've known you for at least 1 week, right? Whereas with inductive arguments, it's a matter of a posteriori knowledge. The conclusion could follow, but you can't know, like, definitively by reason and reason alone that it's going to follow, because there's always a chance that it could not follow. So it's not a priori. So I think that distinction and that connection to concepts earlier is helpful, and that's why I have us do the knowledge type section earlier. So at this point, you know what an argument is, you know what the different types of argument are, and you know how to characterize the different types of arguments and what examples count as each type. So that should be good for now. Now, next class, we're going to start to talk about how we evaluate these things, right? Like how we determine whether they're good or bad, or better or worse. But for now, we can stop here. As always, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out via email or office hours. I'll see you around.